This is One Concerned American. Thanks for listening to today's show. I want to cover the Bush family on this episode. I think when you look at America today, some of the biggest hot topics that we see in the news, like human trafficking, the destruction of Christianity, these are things that you can trace directly back to the Bushes. And in this video, I'm going to show you that not only do they have literal ties to the Nazis, but they probably brought us closer to the world government than any other presidents, and they've actively worked to destroy this country. So let's get started. One of the first things that you should think about before we get into the Bushes is this speech by George H.W. Bush, where he explicitly referenced the New World Order, and he also mentioned the illumination of 1,000 points of light. This is a reference back to the Nazis. If you know, Hitler was building something that he called Third Reich, and he wanted to have a German Empire that would last for 1,000 years, kind of like the original Roman Empire. This is exactly what George Bush was referring to here by 1,000 points of light. And you will see in this video how his family has financial ties to the Nazis, and just like Hitler, his goal was a one world government. Here you can see an image that kind of depicted the whole idea of the 1,000 points of light. And you can see George H.W. Bush in the middle of this huge crowd of Americans. And notice they're all looking at the top of the American flag. They're not really looking at the American flag. They're actually looking at the symbolism here, which is the gold fringe flag. We all know that that basically represents martial law. And the eagle on top, that goes back to a symbol of not only the Germans, but also the Roman Empire. So when you're seeing this gold fringe flag with the eagle on top, that's not the real American flag. And this is actually a communist style propaganda art piece here. So that should tell you something to start off about the Bushes. Now, I think the most interesting tie to what we're seeing right now can be found if you research Operation Brownstone. It's also referred to as Operation Brown Star. This was a case where George H.W. Bush, he was the vice president at the time. They were using the CIA and different agencies to drug different politicians and blackmail them. We also found out in this case that there was a lot of dirty money. For example, if you look at the back of this paper, it says at the top right, the documents show that a number of clients, lawyers, doctors, and business executives used corporate credit cards to procure escort services, and that a number of military officers from the United States and allied countries charged mail escort services. One former top-level Pentagon officer said that for the past 8 years, military and civilian intelligence authorities have been concerned that a nest of homosexuals at top levels of the Reagan administration may have been penetrated by Soviet-backed espionage agents posing as male prostitutes, said one former top-level Pentagon official. What they would actually do is they would grab a politician that they didn't like, and they would take him to these brownstone condos of one of the politicians that they were working with. One of the most common was named Barney Frank. And they would actually slip these people roofies or drug them. They would basically film them in compromising situations with other women. So when you see things like Epstein, when you wonder, how did this island exist where people were young girls and all these people were being trafficked? Well, it's because it was happening here in the United States also, and it was sponsored by our government. It's really interesting to think about that this is something that the Bushes were heavily involved in. Now, one of the books I want to refer to first is called The Two Faces of George Bush, and this is by Professor Anthony Sutton. He's one of the authorities on the Skull and Bones Society at Yale, and he's written a lot of books about them. He's written a lot of books about the New World Order and the Federal Reserve, all types of things. You need to check out Anthony Sutton. And I'm actually going to talk about at the end of this video how I'm trying to set up a digital library where I can share some of these books with you guys. If you can just donate a little bit to my channel, I'll give you access to all the texts that I talk about on the show. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely let me know below. One of the first things we see here is if you look at the Bush family, on the left to the top, you see Brown Brothers Harriman, and that's next to Prescott Sheldon Bush. Prescott Bush was George H.W. Bush's father, and he actually had extensive financial ties to the Nazis. There was a man named Fritz Thyssen who was a Hitler financier, and they were basically keeping money here in a bank that Prescott Bush was working in, I believe. These guys are well connected, they're politicians. George H.W. Bush is extremely well connected, and one of the ways we know this is by his membership in the Skull and Bones Society. And if you look at this image here, this is a cartoon depicting his membership initiation. And if you look on the right, you see a man with the hood, and there's that swirl symbol with the kind of black two-dimensional cube in the center, or it's a pyramid. That's the Trilateral Commission. And if you look at it very carefully, you can see the 666, and it's kind of in a swirling pattern. The man with the dark hood in the center, he has an Illuminati symbol. And then the man on the far left has a pentagram representing Satanism. And if you look into the initiation of the Skull and Bones Society, this is the kind of things that they do. They make you sit in a coffin. They make you do things that are homosexual in nature. And I think a good depiction of this would be that movie, The Good Shepherd, if you've ever gotten a chance to see that. It shows some guys who actually were founders of the CIA, how they went through Skull and Bones, and other members of the group were peeing on them while they had to wrestle in mud, and it was some real sick stuff. I mean, this is the kind of things these elites do to kind of secure a bond and basically have dirt on each other and, form friendships for life, business partnerships. It's how they work. Now, I think if you look at the Bush voting record, I mean, it shows that he's definitely was a snake in the grass. For example, he consistently voted for foreign aid giveaway programs, including those programs that supported and kept in power various Marxist regimes around the world. So, he's telling you that he was a conservative, but he actually voted to give money to countries that were basically communist dictatorships. He voted for the Family Assistance Act. He voted to remove gold cover from the U.S. currency. He voted for the 1968 Gun Control Act. And then in the 1980 elections, he was telling people that he opposed gun control. He voted for the 1968 Housing and Urban Development Act. So he basically was a socialist. He wasn't really conservative if you look at his record. He was really into this process called mundialization. And, mundo means world in Latin, basically. And this was kind of a process where certain cities around the world were trying to get the label as a world city, and they would start flying the United Nations flag alongside the United States flag. And we can actually see here, at one point, Richfield, Ohio became the first American city to join the New World Order by going through this mundialization process. And this is what George Bush said about it. He said, quote, "Permit me to congratulate you and the other members of your community on your proclamation of mundialization. There cannot be anything more encouraging to us here than to hear from a community like yours that supports the United Nations and believes in it and its importance to the establishment of world peace. Equally significant is your community's commitment to help increase understanding among the peoples of the world, for without that understanding, peace among peoples can never be achieved. What a profound contribution Richfield is making to man's greatest efforts to build a world in which all the pledges of the UN Charter will truly govern relations among nations." So he basically says, Richfield, you are contributing to the New World Order here. And this is a joke. I mean, like the United Nations is contributing to world peace, there's literally been nonstop war since the United Nations has been created. So I don't know what that's talking about. I think more government is just going to kill more people at the end of the day. And he knows that, and that's part of the plan. I mean, you can see here another political cartoon showing him with the world in his hands, having been quoted in Vista magazine that, this is one world. And you can see the United States Constitution is in the dustbin of history in the background. So don't let these guys fool you. I mean, there's a lot of phony conservatives out there, and I think that Bush is a prime example. And I think one of the other things we need to get into when it comes to the Bush family is their connections to drug trafficking. Let me give you just one statistic. In 1972, the flow of heroin into the United States was about 60 tons. And after the Bush program in 1986, it was 600 tons, 10 times greater. It is projected as 900 tons for 1987. Why? Because under Bush, the anti-drug overlord, the Thai government with U.S. government assistance, built a 2-lane paved highway right into the heroin-producing Golden Triangle. Heroin can now be transported by 10-ton trucks rather than by horse and mule. This is the Bush anti-drug interdiction program at work. And you can see that Francis M. Mullen Jr., he was the head of the DEA in 1984. He called Bush's drug enforcement program an intellectual fraud and a liability rather than an asset. We also have some ties through the Contras and drugs. Apparently, Bush had dealings with a man named Felix Rodriguez, and he was a known cocaine and money launderer who was in prison when this book was written. And Felix Rodriguez of the CIA asked Ramon Rodriguez to handle a $10 million cocaine deal while Felix was working for the National Security Council. This is one of numerous cocaine and heroin deals linked to CIA by this CBS program. The key is that George Bush, according to the newspaper articles we reproduce here, knows and has worked with Felix Rodriguez. So, the connections are there. And just think about the movie American Gangster. A lot of people have heard of Frank Lucas. The guy was selling this heroin. They were calling it blue magic, right? And if you look, right, how did he get it into the country? There was military connections there that were helping him bring it in. That's the only way it comes in. A lot of people talk about the drugs coming from Mexico. Well, the cartel have a big deal in that. So the militaries on all sides are a part of it. They want the drugs to come into the country because it keeps you more docile. Interestingly, also, if you go further in the two faces of George Bush, they point out that the DEA actually shared an office and a receptionist with a bank in Thailand that was a known drug money laundering bank. And there were CIA operatives, and even more disturbing, when the CIA operatives shared an office in Chiang Mai with the DEA, the director of the CIA at the time was George Bush. So we know he was up to some sketchy stuff. We have these pedophilia connections and sex trafficking connections. We have the drug connections. And this is how the family got all their money. Literal American Nazis. If you go a little further, I think you'll also find some disturbing connections between the Bushes and the bin Ladens. As in Osama bin Laden, we all know who was, according to the government story, one of the main perpetrators in September 11th. And they're practically related to the Bush family. If you look at this site here, this is from Global Research. They list 10 connections between the Bushes and the bin Ladens. And you can see here, number 10 says the connections between the bin Laden and Bush families go back decades. Perhaps the first time of note that their paths crossed would be in 1978, when George W. Bush and Salim bin Laden, the brother of Osama, set up Arbusto Energy in Texas. The business was far from a success, however, and by the mid-80s, it was taken over by a company called Harken Energy. This takeover raised suspicions that would be proven correct when examination of the company underwriting the takeover to the tune of millions of dollars exposed various corruption scandals, and there were many Saudi investors connected to Arbusto. So the Bushes and the bin Ladens have a lot of connections in oil. Not only that, but if you go a little further, they also have some connections in heroin. The number one connection here actually says on this website, perhaps one of the most overlooked aspects of the Bush-bin Laden connection is the drug trafficking accusations following the invasion of Afghanistan, claims that have hounded the Bush family in particular for decades. Whereas the Taliban had expressed support for the aforementioned pipeline, they weren't so supportive, and in fact were completely against the producing and trafficking of heroin from the vast supplies of opium in the country. While the CIA and in turn other intelligence agencies would look the other way and essentially allow the opium trade to flourish, the Taliban were actively attempting to shut down such activities. So you can go see this today. You'll see the pictures of U.S. soldiers in the poppy fields. Look into it. One of George H.W. Bush's nicknames is even Poppy. Everybody calls him Poppy. It's like they're talking about it in plain sight for everyone. So it's not really even that much of a secret to people who have researched it. And just to think that these guys were walking around this whole time, and most people didn't really know. So that's why I wanted to make this to share it with you. I think another great source you can look into for understanding how the government and the military was complicit in bringing in these drugs into the country you can look into this story called Dark Alliance, the story behind the crack explosion. And it was written by this man named Gary Webb. And what Gary Webb did was really interesting. In this book, he exposed how the CIA brought drugs into this country and they sent them to undesirable places around the country. And then they used this money to fund black operations in different countries in Latin America and topple a lot of different dictators and basically put governments that were more friendly with the United States and the world government in charge. Gary Webb was trying to warn people about this. He actually said that he thought something might happen to him and that he was definitely not suicidal. And what do you think happened to him? He was shot twice in the head, and it was actually ruled a suicide. It's very disturbing to me. I think you need to look into the Bushes. I think a lot of what we're seeing right now will make more sense when you understand how much they did to bring us to this point. And I think George W. Bush is just as guilty. If you look into him, he's also a Skull and Bones member, just like his father. And when he ran against John Kerry for president, they were both actually members, and neither of them could really talk about the time that they spent in it. They both outright refused. So there's some very suspicious things about that. I mean, what are the odds of two men running for president who are both members of one of the most exclusive, secretive societies in the United States, even the world? I mean, what are the odds, really? It's mathematically impossible. You've also got the fact that, we all know Donald Rumsfeld was on W's cabinet, and just a day before September 11th, Rumsfeld gets out there and he announced that $2.3 trillion went missing from the Pentagon. And then September 11th happened and nobody really cared about that anymore. Nobody was asking the question. But I guarantee you, this tells me somewhere along the line that W had to be complicit. Things don't happen like that while you're the chief executive, unless you're just a complete blundering fool. So you should be concerned. You should be looking into this and trying to figure out where that money went. Just think of me as a prospector here, giving you the supplies and the sources, and you can go look into this further. Because I got a family, I got a daughter. I'm just trying to spread this information and hopefully make a few extra bucks here and there. Now, one of the next things I also think you need to look in is their connections to other politicians and royalty. The Bush family actually is related to the royal family in England. They're also related to Obama. You can see here they're related to Rush Limbaugh and Sarah Palin. I mean, this is just insane. And we know a lot of these politicians on both sides are basically all related, and they're just playing their games to keep us divided, y'all. That's why I support the president for the most part, but at the end of the day, I want to see someone that can bring people together, and I want to see people get more educated. And, we're going to have to share this information and just stick it out with people that are hard-headed right now, because they will see the truth eventually. I also want to talk to you about this book by J.H. Hatfield called Fortunate Son. And this book actually had a lot of sources in it that showed that George W. Bush had basically a cocaine problem, and that he was known to get in trouble and do a lot of drugs. And if you look into this, it's very interesting because the author, J.H. Hatfield, wound up dead. And they said it was a drug overdose, but a lot of people are very suspicious about this because, the time the book came out, it also exposed some of the connections with the Bushes and the Bin Ladens. It showed how George H.W. Bush had somewhat of a phony war record. You guys need to look into this stuff. I mean, if you're okay with all this, something is definitely not right in your head. I hope that you're sharing it, and let me know what you think about all this in the discussion below. Again, I want to try to get a digital library set up where I can share some of these books with you guys. So if that's something you'd be interested in, let me know. I have the Two Faces of George Bush. I have almost every book by Anthony Sutton available. I have Dark Alliance available. And for just a small donation, like $2, I'll give you access to all these books that I have. So let me know what you think in the comment section. The last thing I want to say is that if you're a Trumper, in my opinion, you're not a serious patriot if you don't have a problem with Steve Mnuchin, because he is a member of Skull and Bones, just like both Presidents Bush, just like John Kerry, and this man also worked with Soros. He worked for Goldman Sachs, And when Donald Trump was debating, he said you couldn't trust people who took money from Goldman Sachs, like Ted Cruz, because he said they were bought and paid for. And then Donald Trump made this guy who was a Goldman Sachs CEO his Secretary of the Treasury. Seriously? And I think you need to look into the stimulus because it's not just free money, folks. The government doesn't have anything to give you that it can't take from you first. So you need to be very cautious about it because it's not exactly everything that it's made out to be. Think about it. It's $2 trillion and there's 300 million people in America. So something ain't right, folks. You need to be thinking about this. I think that there are some serious issues going around that we need to study. Support the president if you want. I support him for the most part, but I need to see him take some serious action against the feds. I'm going to need to see some major arrests if he wants my vote. And that's just my take in this whole matter. So let me know what you think in the comment section below. God bless.
A new world order. A new world order. A new world order.
And we are, as a people, opposed to secret societies.
This is extremely dangerous to democracy.